Welcome to the latest in the series of Photography Basics. What we're going to do today is take the lessons that we've learned in the past, put them all together and start talking about this. This is the exposure triangle. In previous videos we've talked about aperture, shutter speed and ISO. What the exposure diagram is basically a simple way of saying in order to get the perfect exposure for your shot, you need to combine elements of these three things. It's also a simple way of showing that if you're just one, you've got to adjust something else in order to keep the perfect triangle. For example, if you bump up your ISO, you might need to take down your shutter speed or your aperture in order to compensate for it. Now this is something that you can follow along with at home. Pick up your camera, put it in manual mode and try and get the perfect exposure. You should be able to get the perfect exposure within 3 shots. So today, just for an example, I'm going to be taking a picture of this. This is a scale model of the Gemini 4 capsule, piloted by James McDivitt and Ed White. This is the mission on which Ed White done the first US spacewalk. And in order to take the picture, I'll be using this. This is a Canon 70-200 f2.8 lens. It doesn't matter what lens you've got, what equipment you've got, these principles are the same for everything. Now since I've got a model, what I want to do is set the aperture on this lens to the lowest f-stop that I've got, f2.8, in order to get a narrow depth of field and try and isolate the subject. Now since I already know that's what I want to do with my f-stop, I've got 2 things left to play with, my ISO and my shutter speed. So I will be adjusting one of those 2 things in order to get the perfect exposure. Let's take a shot and see what the results are. Now as you can see from the shot, we're overexposed, there's too much light. I want to keep my f-stop at 2.8, so what I'll do is I'll reduce my ISO and take another shot and see what happens. We're currently at ISO 1600. Let's take it down 2 stops to ISO 400, take another shot and see what the results are. And there you go. As you can see, we've now got the perfect exposure, a great picture. Now this was shot at 1/60th of a second, which for a static object like that is perfectly fine. But what happens if I want to bump up my shutter speed? Well, as you know with the exposure triangle, if you adjust one setting, you've got to adjust one of the other 2 settings in order to keep the perfect exposure. Now I want to keep it at f2.8, so if I bump up my shutter speed, that only leaves ISO, so I'm going to need to bump up my ISO once again. So let's put it on 1/250th of a second, which is 2 stops for shutter speed. Bump up my ISO by 2 stops, which will take me back up to ISO 1600, take a shot and see what happens. And as you can see, we've got the exact same picture, perfect exposure. Now what happens, for example, if I want to bump up my aperture? I'm currently at 2.8, I want to take it to say f5.6. Well, that's two stops. f2.8, f4, f5.6. Bumping up your aperture means you're letting in less light, so you've got to compensate for that. So rather than just putting up my ISO setting by another 2 stops, let's put up my ISO setting by 1 stop and reduce my shutter speed by 1 stop down to 1/125th of a second. 1/125th of a second. So we're at f5.6. We want to take the ISO up to ISO 3200, it's 1 stop. And we want to take the shutter speed down to 1/125th of a second. Let's take a picture and find out. And as you can see from the picture, perfect once again. And that's really all that the exposure triangle is. It's the 3 settings that you need to adjust in order to get the perfect exposure for your photograph. Now the only thing that you sort of really need to think about is what is it you're shooting. If you're shooting sports, say the Indy Grand Prix or a baseball game, you're going to want a fast shutter speed. So you dial in your shutter speed and then you adjust your ISO and your aperture to compensate. If you're shooting a model or something that's fairly static, chances are you're going to want a low aperture to isolate the subject, so you would adjust your ISO and your shutter speed in order to compensate for that. If you're shooting indoors in low light, you're going to want a high ISO. You want your sensor to be more sensitive to the available light. So if you're shooting at a high ISO, that leaves you your shutter speed and your aperture in order to get the perfect exposure. If you adjust one, you've got to adjust one or both of the others in order to compensate. That's all the exposure triangle is. Simple as that. So pick up your camera, put it in manual mode, grab something, doesn't matter what, whether it's a DVD or a picture, it really doesn't matter, and take some pictures and experiment. Just like everything else, the more you do it, the better you're going to get.